Well, for more insight into the business and economic ties between China and France, we're joined by Nicolas Veron. He's Senior Fellow at Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, as well as the Peterson Institute for International Economics right here in Washington. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So in terms of the types and the volumes of investment that we're seeing between China and France, what are we looking at?
Well, I think it has to be framed as President Macron has framed this visit as the first of many. He said he would come every year to China. He's just been elected. He wants to be re-elected, so he looks forward to 10 years of that kind of relationship. And so I think the one-off achievements have to be framed in that context. So we'll see up to the end of the visit, but so far it looks good. Macron in his domestic political environment is increasingly popular, which is unusual for a French president. Generally, their popularity decreases. Now it's increasing for him, so he's pretty confident he doesn't need an immediate big success or big deal. So he has time on his side, or at least that seems to be the way he views it.
And what about the trajectory of Chinese investments in France? What have they tended to focus on?
Well, Chinese investment in France is not very different from other European countries. So they're looking for technology, for brands, for knowledge, as opposed to commodities or raw materials as in other parts of the world. Very similar to the profile in the US, actually. It's been growing, of course, like in other advanced economies, very fast in the last few years. There are a lot of misgivings. People are nervous about Chinese investment occasionally. But at the same time, and I think fortunately President Macron has said that, there's a willingness to have more, Chinese investment in France, also more French investment in China, and a more open environment.
And let's also look at bilateral trade ties. Where does that stand, especially given their views on globalization?
Well, clearly, France, like many similar economies, has a deficit with China. Macron has emphasized the fact that trade in general, the Belt and Road framework in particular, had to be two-way streets. As any leader, he wants to export more to China and not just import more. But I think he's made a pretty nice framework of it by saying that what he wanted was more on both sides and not just an imbalanced relationship. So there is a clear rejection of protectionism, not a France first, like America first rhetoric, but rather a kind of win-win rhetoric, which is very similar from what we hear from Chinese leaders time and again.
Now, you touched on the Belt and Road Initiative. We saw that France has shown some interest in it. How do you see their role in that initiative?
Macron has been cautious. He has said early on that his intent in this trip was to better understand the Belt and Road Initiative. He has emphasized the fact that the rhetoric about Belt and Road has varied over time, so he wants to understand what's really in there and how France could contribute constructively to it or have a constructive attitude to it. I think the main message is we welcome the Belt and Road, saying it's not adversarial, it's not a competing project, but we want to better understand it.
Now, it's interesting that the Economy and Finance Minister, Bruno Le Maire, said in an interview that France was looking to China and Russia to really counterbalance as a counterweight to increasingly uncertain trade relations with the US and Britain. How do you think that should be interpreted?
I didn't read that or watch that interview. My impression from President Macron, looking at it also from the US, is that he doesn't treat China the same way as Russia. And this is also a function of the rhetoric of China as opposed to Russia. China typically emphasizes win-win arrangements. Russia tends to frame everything as a zero-sum game, so win-lose, lose-win. It's a very different framing. And I think the attitude to China is different from the attitude to Russia, also from the perspective of this trip.
Now, one thing we certainly see converging attitudes on is climate change. So with both countries, both China and France, really signaling wanting to take that leadership role as the US tends to step back, how do you see them cooperating on that front?
Yeah, Macron made a big deal of saying, make the planet great again, which is his slogan in Chinese. I think it got a lot of comment in Chinese media on the way he was struggling with the Chinese language. Yeah, no, I think this is a very strong aspect of the partnership, obviously, not just from a French perspective, but from a European perspective. And this is an area in which Europe is united and united also with China. The Paris Accord is taken seriously. We want to reduce carbon emissions over the medium to long term. And that's obviously in contrast to the US, also perhaps to Russia, as this remains to be seen. So this, I think, is a positive area for the discussion between Macron and Xi Jinping, but something that is very prominent also in the domestic rhetoric and in the European rhetoric of President Macron.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Nicolas Veron, the Senior Fellow at Bruegel and the Peterson Institute for International Economics.